The last piece of firewood settled into place with a sound like a door closing on something that could never be reopened. Clara Mae Whitfield pressed her palm flat against the split face of the cottonwood, feeling the cold that had already begun to work its way into the grain, and for a moment she simply stood there in the pale October light with her hand against the wood and her eyes closed. Her breath made small, white clouds that the wind immediately erased. The stack rose higher than her head now. 3 chords, solid, dense, a wall between her family and whatever the sky was planning. She had not let herself feel anything resembling safety in so long that the sensation arriving without warning in the form of a stack of firewood nearly brought her to her knees. She didn't let it. Instead, she reached into the pocket of her worn canvas apron. Her fingers found what they always found, a small creek stone, smooth and gray and oval cool even through the fabric. Her son Thomas had pressed it into her hands 6 weeks ago, without explanation, the way 6-year-olds offer gifts with total seriousness and no ceremony whatsoever. She turned it over twice, the texture of it grounding her the way the stone itself was grounded, the way the granite vaulting above her was grounded, rooted so far into the earth that no winter had ever moved it, and no winter ever would. She had not always known that immovable things could be a mercy. 3 months earlier, she had known a different kind of solidity, the solidity of a rented farmhouse with a warped front door, a productive kitchen garden, a landlord who nodded to her in town with something that passed for respect. That solidity had turned out to be borrowed. The farmhouse belonged to a man named Greer, who needed the land for his son, and the respect had belonged to a version of her life that Silas Drummond's will had erased in a single afternoon. The office of the attorney Aldous Crane smelled of beeswax and ambition. It occupied the most substantial building on the main street of the settlement, 2 full stories of dressed timber with glass windows that caught the light in a way that announced loudly and without apology that the man inside had prospered. Clara Mae had been inside it once before to sign the lease on the farmhouse, and she had sat in the same chair she sat in now across the same wide desk, with the same sense that the room was designed to remind visitors of their relative insignificance. Elias sat beside her. His hands were folded on his knees, carpenter's hands scarred at the knuckles, permanently darkened in the creases with sawdust that no amount of washing fully removed. He was 38 years old and looked both older and younger than that, older in the lines around his eyes, and younger in the directness of his gaze, which had never learned to perform the appropriate degree of deference. She had loved that about him from the beginning. She loved it still, even now, even as his breathing produced a faint whistle on the exhale that she had learned to track the way a sailor tracks a barometer. Thomas sat between them, his small body very straight, his hands wrapped around a folded piece of cloth that contained his current collection of creekstones. He had his father's eyes and his mother's mouth and some quality entirely his own that Clara Mae had never been able to name. A watchfulness, a stillness, as though he were constantly taking inventory of the world around him and filing the information away for later use. Crane read the will with the professional neutrality of a man who had long since stopped being surprised by what the dying chose to do with their accumulated bitterness. Silas Drummond, Clara Mae's mother's brother, a man who had built his prosperity on hard land and harder judgments, had arranged his final accounting with the thoroughness that had characterized every other transaction of his life. To his sons, Randall and George, he left the eastern and western pastures, respectively, along with the cattle, the equipment, the water rights, and the reputation he had spent 40 years constructing. To the First Methodist Church of the settlement, he left a sum that would fund a new bell tower and ensure his name appeared on a bronze plaque for the next century. To his niece, Clara Mae Whitfield, née Drummond, and her husband, Elias Whitfield, he left a parcel of land designated in the county survey as Drummond's Folly, 17 acres of sheer granite escarpment on the north face of the valley, unsuitable for grazing, unsuitable for cultivation, unsuitable by any conventional measure for human habitation, including as an apparent afterthought in the final clause the cave structure at the base of the rock face. Crane slid the deed across the desk with 2 fingers the way a man moves something he'd rather not touch with his whole hand. From somewhere in the room, she never identified exactly where came the sound of a breath being released through a nose, the involuntary exhalation of suppressed amusement. One of Silas's sons, one of Crane's clerks. It didn't matter. Clara May looked at the deed and did not look at anyone else in the room, and what she thought about was not Silas and not the laughter and not the 17 useless acres. She thought about her grandmother, a woman named Ruth, who had come west in a wagon with nothing but a Bible and a knowledge of plants, and who had told her once in the particular tone she reserved for things she considered essential. Stone doesn't make promises, child, but stone doesn't break them either. She picked up the deed with both hands. Elias said nothing. Thomas looked at the paper, then at his mother's face, and seemed to conclude that whatever was happening was within the range of things that could be survived. They walked out of Crane's office into the flat October sunlight. The three of them, in the main street of the settlement, received them the way small places always receive the newly humiliated, with a silence louder than noise, with eyes that slid sideways and found something else to examine. Clara May walked with her shoulders level and her chin at a height that communicated nothing at all. Behind her, she heard someone, a woman she thought, from the dry goods, begin a sentence that ended before it properly began. She did not look back. She had decided in the moment her fingers touched the deed that she was finished looking back. The farmhouse lease expired at the end of the month. The landlord, a decent enough man, in the particular way that men can be decent when decency costs them nothing, expressed something approximating regret when he told them his son would be needing the place. Come November, they had 22 days. They had a cast iron pot, 2 wool blankets, Elias's tools in their canvas roll, a 20-pound sack of seed potatoes that had been intended for next year's garden, the family Bible, whatever else fit in the handcart. Clara May packed with the efficiency of someone who has thought quietly and without drama about what actually matters. She left the curtains she'd sewn for the kitchen windows. She left the rocking chair that had belonged to the landlord anyway. She took the hatchet, the small tin of rendered lard, every jar she owned, every seed packet, every strip of dried meat, the ball of twine, the whetstone, the extra wool socks she'd been knitting since August finished in September, when the nights turned cool and she'd needed something to do with her hands, while Elias coughed by the fire. Thomas packed his own bundle without being asked, his stones, his cloth figures, a small piece of birch bark with an owl drawn on it in charcoal that Elias had made him during one of the long evenings. They left on a Tuesday morning when the light was still low and orange and the frost had not yet melted from the grass. The handcart wheels found every rut in the road. Elias pulled from the front while Clara May steadied the load from behind, and Thomas walked beside her with his bundle under his arm, his small boots hitting the road with a purposefulness that Clara May found in some complicated way she couldn't fully articulate, the most heartening thing she had witnessed in months. She felt the eyes she always felt as. She had grown up in a small place and knew how attention moved through a community like water, through soil, finding every crack. She felt them from the hardware store, from the church steps, where 2 women stood with their coats buttoned against the morning cold, from the window above the dry goods, where a curtain shifted. She kept her eyes on the road ahead, on the escarpment that rose at the far end of the valley, gray and massive, and entirely indifferent to what anyone thought of it. That indifference she was beginning to understand was its own kind of gift. They reached Drummond's Folly. She refused internally to call it by that name, though she had no replacement for it yet in the early afternoon. The granite rose above them in a sheer face that caught the wind coming down from the north and deflected it in odd directions, so that standing at the base felt like standing inside something moving. The cave mouth was set low in the rock, perhaps 4 feet high, at the entrance, widening as it went back the ceiling, lifting to accommodate a standing adult within the first 10 feet. Elias stood at the entrance for a long moment. His hands went to the tool roll on the cart without apparent decision, found the measuring cord unrolled 3 feet of it. He stood with the cord between his hands and his eyes moving across the walls, the ceiling, the irregular floor littered with debris, and the scattered bones of something small. Clara May watched him and understood exactly what was happening. He was not seeing what was there. He was seeing what could be built. She had fallen in love with him for many reasons, but this was near the top. This capacity to look at the present condition of something and see its potential shape, to read a space the way other men read text for meaning that wasn't yet visible. Thomas crouched at the cave entrance, picked up a stone, examined it, set it in his pocket. The smell was damp earth and disuse and something older underneath, both the smell of geological time of a space that had been dark for centuries. Clara May breathed it in deliberately, the way her grandmother had taught her to breathe new places fully, without flinching, so that the body could make its assessment without interference from the mind's preferences. What she registered was cold but not brutal, dry in the back away from the entrance. No smell of standing water, which meant drainage was working. The ceiling fissure she could see from the entrance, a natural crack running toward the rear, that was ventilation, or the beginning of it. The floor will take 3 days. Elias said, not to her particularly, not to the cave, not to the air between them, just a statement of fact, a first entry in a list he was already making. 4 if the scree goes deep. Clara May said, I'll find the water source this afternoon. Thomas looked up from where he'd crouched to examine something near the wall. What's pemmican? Neither of them had said the word aloud, but he'd heard it 3 days ago when she'd been talking to herself in the kitchen of the farmhouse while she packed, reminding herself of what she needed to make before the cold set in. Food that doesn't give up, she told him. He considered this, nodded, went back to his stone. The first 3 days were the hardest, and also in a way she wouldn't have been able to explain to anyone who hadn't experienced it, the most clarifying of her adult life. Elias worked on the floor with a focused intensity that bordered on the devotional, prying up embedded stones with the wrecking bars carrying them out, bucket by improvised bucket, using the cast iron pot, using the largest flat stones to begin constructing the low wall across the entrance that would deflect the wind. He worked until the light failed and started again when it returned, stopping only to drink water, eat whatever Clara May put in front of him, and cough, which he did with his back turned, the way a private person keeps private things private. The cough had started after the fever. The fever had come 3 years ago in the wet autumn of 1875, settling in his chest and staying there for 6 weeks before it broke and left him alive but altered. The doctor in town had called it a lung ailment and recommended rest and dry air in the general category of things that were easy to prescribe and difficult to arrange. Elias had gone back to his carpentry work as soon as he could stand for more than an hour to stretch. The cough had become a fixture, like the scar on his left forearm from the chisel that had slipped in 1872, something that was simply part of the landscape of him now. Clara May tracked it the way she tracked the weather. Not with anxiety exactly, with attention. There was a difference between those two things, and the difference mattered. While Elias worked the floor, she and Thomas worked the land around the cave, or rather the particular strip of creek valley that the land included, because the 17 acres of sheer rock offered nothing plantable and little else of obvious value. What it offered, she was already discovering, was water. The creek that ran 40 yards from the cave mouth was clean running over a gravel bed, cold enough to keep things and clear enough to read the bottom. She tested it the way her grandmother had taught her, smell, color, the behavior of the current around the rocks, and found it sound. Along its banks, she found the first of many things she would come to think of as the valley's vocabulary stands of cattail going dry and brown but still useful, their roots edible, and their fluff insulating. Buffalo berry bushes with their last bright clusters hanging in the cold bitter, alone but transformative, when dried and pounded with fat. A plant her grandmother had called Winter's Friend. She didn't know its formal name, had never needed to, with small, dark leaves and a resinous smell that made a tea steeped long and taken hot that could open a congested chest and quiet a persistent cough. She gathered everything with Thomas beside her, showing him each plant before she harvested it, explaining in the particular ways she'd been taught, not naming properties first, but asking him to observe first. What shape is the leaf? What does it smell like when you crush it? Where is it growing, sunny side or shadow side? He absorbed this without apparent effort, asking questions that were sometimes so precisely targeted that she had to pause and reconsider the things she'd been about to say. On the fourth evening, she made the first batch of tea from the winter's friend leaves and set a cup beside Elias where he sat at the small fire they'd built outside. He looked at it, looked at her, drank it without comment. That night, his cough was quieter. She noted this without expression and began planning how large a supply of the dried leaves she could accumulate before the first snow. Elias had found up the creek to the north, a stand of fallen aspen dead dry, a straight grain, the kind of timber that made a carpenter's hands want to do things. Over the following week, working in stages because the hauling was heavy and his lungs required negotiation, he brought the best pieces back and began to frame the door. Not a simple curtain hung over the opening, which would have been faster. A door, a proper wooden door with a frame scribed to fit the irregular contours of the rock entrance, hung on iron hinges he'd brought in the tool roll, fitted so precisely that when it closed and she heard him test it over and over, the soft thud of it, not a thread of light appeared at the edges. He also, without announcing that he was doing it, built shelves. He worked the uneven cave walls with the same patient attention he had given the floor, finding the natural ledges and augmenting them, scribing each shelf board to sit flush against rock that had been formed by forces that predated carpentry by several geological epochs. The shelves went in along both sides of the main chamber, and they were, Clara May thought, watching them take shape over 3 days, the most beautiful things she had ever seen. Not because of any elegance in their construction, though they were elegantly constructed, but because of what they meant. Shelves meant storage. Storage meant winter. Winter was the thing they were going to survive. She filled them as fast as he built them. The clay jars came from the creek bend, a deposit of blue-gray clay she'd noticed on the third day, half hidden by dead grass, the kind of material her grandmother had used for everything from water vessels to poultices. She and Thomas spent 2 afternoons digging and hauling, then another 3 afternoons working the clay on a flat rock in the watery October sunshine, rolling it, pounding it, shaping it into vessels of various sizes. Thomas was unafraid of the mess and showed an unexpected aptitude for the work, his small hands producing walls of surprising evenness. They fired the keys in a wood fire outside, losing 4 to cracking, but ending with 17 usable vessels. Clara May filled them methodically, dried buffalo berries in 3, cattail root flour in 2, the winter's friend leaves in 1 carefully sealed with a wax cloth, dried wild onion, rendered fat from the last of their salt pork, ground thistle seed, a mixture of dried meat and fat that she was already in her head beginning to develop into something more substantial, something dense, long-lasting, portable, something that would function when everything else had been exhausted. Thomas watched her work one evening and asked, "Is this what rich looks like?" She stopped. The question hit something she hadn't known was there. She thought about Aldous Crane's office, the polished desk, the glass windows catching the light. She thought about Silas Drummond's pastures, his cattle moving in their slow herds across land that would now pass to sons who had never questioned their right to it. "Rich is knowing you'll eat in February," she said finally. "Everything else is decoration." He appeared to find this satisfactory. He went back to his twig figures. The fireplace took Elias 4 full days. He approached it with the seriousness of a structural problem, which it was a question of physics and airflow and the behavior of heat in an enclosed stone space. He selected the river rocks himself, carrying them up from the creek bed in loads that made his breathing labor in ways she monitored from the corner of her vision without letting him see her watching. The mortar he mixed from the blue-gray clay and dried grass proportions, adjusted through trial, and a day's observation until the mixture behaved the way he needed it to. He built the firebox low and wide, the flue narrow, and specifically angled to draw smoke toward the natural fissure in the ceiling, a crack approximately 4 inches wide at its narrowest point, running back through the rock. And as Elias had determined by dropping a lit piece of twisted grass into the air column above it, connected to the outside air in a way that created a reliable draft. At the upper right corner of the fissure's base, where the crack met the cave ceiling, he mortared in a flat stone that could be shifted with a stick, a damper of sorts, primitive but functional, capable of regulating airflow. Beside it in the ceiling itself, he drilled a hole the width of his thumb through a thinner section of rock, screening it with a piece of copper mesh he'd salvaged from a broken strainer in the bottom of the toolkit. This was ventilation independent of the fire-fresh air, even when the damper was closed, even when the door was sealed against a blizzard, even when the world outside had decided to become something other than breathable. He tested the whole system on a cold evening in late October, building a fire in the new hearth and sealing the door and watching the smoke with the patience of a man who had built things all his life and understood that a thing untested is a thing unknown. The smoke went up and through and out. The fresh air came in through the copper mesh, barely perceptible but present, a thin cold thread in the warmer cave air. The temperature inside climbed steadily and then stabilized at something Clara May could only describe as survivable. In a good way, not the brutal warmth of a room overheated, but the steady, bone-level warmth of a space that had been thought through. Elias sat back on his heels and looked at what he'd built. It'll hold. Those two words were she had learned over years of marriage, his version of profound satisfaction. October moved toward November with the particular urgency that high-latitude autumns develop once they decide to be serious. The cottonwood along the creek went gold, and then the gold blew away overnight. The creek ran slower, something thickening in it that wasn't quite ice yet, but was remembering the concept. The mornings arrived harder and colder, the frost deeper each day, and the sky began its seasonal shift from the variable blues of summer towards something more committed and less forgiving. Clara May worked with a productivity that surprised even herself. The garden, a narrow terrace of rich soil, she'd carried apronful by apronful from a deposit of dark earth she'd found upstream, arranged on a protected ledge outside the cave mouth, and held in place by a low rock border, had produced better than she'd expected. The potatoes, especially a late variety she'd chosen deliberately for their storage qualities, had bulked up nicely in the weeks since planting. She dug them in the first week of November and carried them inside, burying them in dry sand in the cold storage area that Elias had partitioned off at the rear of the cave, a space where the temperature remained naturally and consistently cold, without freezing exactly what root vegetables required to last through a long winter. She was building pemmican by then, the serious version, the version her grandmother had made. Dried buffalo berries pounded to a coarse paste, rendered fat from the pork rind they'd saved, and from the single piece of suet she'd traded a jar of wild onions to get from a passing freighter who'd seemed more amused than interested in the transaction. Pine nuts she'd gathered from the trees above the escarpment, laboriously cracked and picked. She mixed these together in proportions she'd learned not from any written source, but from her grandmother's hands moving through the same motions in a different kitchen, in a different October, in a different life. She packed the finished pemmican into cloth squares, sealed them with fat, stored them in the coldest part of the rear chamber. Dense, caloric, stable for months. Food that didn't give up. Thomas, sitting beside her during one of these sessions, asked her to tell him about great-grandmother Ruth. Clara May talked for an hour, her hands never stopping their work, describing a woman who had crossed the plains with less than they currently own and had made of that crossing not a tragedy, but an education. Ruth had known the name and use of every plant in a 3-state region. She had set broken bones, treated fevers, delivered children, navigated 3 consecutive drought years without losing her household. She had died at 74, apparently of simple completion, as though she had finished the task she'd come west to accomplish and found no compelling reason to continue. Was she scared? Thomas asked. Clara May thought about this honestly. Probably, but she didn't let scared stop the work. He nodded, filed it away. It was on a Wednesday afternoon in early November when the light was thin and flat and coming in at an angle that made everything look temporary, that the figure appeared at the tree line. She saw him before he moved to stillness among the bare wire aspen. That was the particular stillness of a person trying to determine whether a situation was safe. Old man. Buckskin coat worn to the texture of old bark. Long rifle carried with the ease of long habit. A single mule behind him loaded but not heavily. He stood at the edge of the trees and watched the cave and the wood pile and the garden terrace and the thin smoke making its way up through the fissure in the rock face, and he watched for perhaps 5 minutes without moving. Clara May kept working. She was shelling the last of a batch of dried beans, moving through them with her thumbs continuing with the same rhythm she'd maintained before she noticed the man, because her grandmother had told her that panicked people invite panic toward them, and calm people invite a different quality of attention. Thomas was beside her, very still, in his particular way, watching the tree line. The man finally walked toward them. His steps were measured and even stopping at what felt like a considered distance, not so far as to seem timid, not so close as to be presumptuous. His face was weathered past the point of easy age estimation, the skin creased by decades of weather, into a topography as readable in its way as the rock above them. Walt Greer. He said it like a statement of something already established, the way people who spend time alone sometimes reintroduce themselves to the human world as a reminder rather than an introduction. He took in the woodpile the doorframe Elias had fitted so precisely, the shelves visible through the open doorway, with their clay jars ranked in order of size, the garden terrace with its cleared stalks, and something moved through his expression that was not quite approval, because approval implies the right to withhold it. What moved through Walt Greer's face was more like recognition. Elias came to the doorway, hands on a latch pin he'd been fitting, turned from a piece of hardwood. Walt's eyes went from the pin to Elias's hands to the doorframe's precision, then back to the woodpile. "Folks in town are saying Drummond left you nothing but a hole in the ground." His voice had the quality of a man who chose words the way a careful carpenter chooses nails for fit, not volume. "Elias, we have what we need. No defensiveness in it, a statement of inventory." Walt looked up at the cliff face above them, tracing something in the pattern of the rock that Clara May hadn't yet learned to read. "This valley funnels the north wind," he said to the air between them, rather than to either of them specifically. "When the real snow comes, it doesn't fall straight. It drifts, piles against anything standing. I've seen it cover a 2-story barn to the roofline." His gaze came back down and settled on the cave entrance, with the low outer wall Elias had built across it, and something shifted in his expression, a faint recalibration, the adjustment of a prediction. A hole in the ground isn't the worst place to be in a blizzard. He unstrapped a smoked ham from the mule with practiced efficiency, set it on the flat rock near the garden terrace. "Trade you for potatoes when they're ready." Not charity, not pity, a transaction between people who would be sharing a winter in the same general geography and found mutual advantage in the arrangement. It was the first time since the reading of Silas Drummond's will that anyone had spoken to them as though they were simply neighbors. In the simplicity of it, the absolute absence of any additional freight was almost more than Clara May knew what to do with. She said, "We'll have potatoes in the spring. Good ones." Her voice was steady and the offer was genuine. Walt looked at Thomas. Thomas looked back at him with his characteristic directness. Walt nodded at whatever he saw there. He turned to go, then stopped. "If the big one comes before December, and my bones say it might, don't open your door until you've had 2 full days of silence. Snow settles and hardens. A door opened too soon into packed drift does 2 things: lets your heat out, and can mean the drift behind it holds the door shut when you try to close again." He left the way he'd come back through the aspen, the mule following without being led. Thomas watched him go, then looked at Clara May. "He's been watching the sky a long time." "Yes," she said. "That's what 40 years of reading something looks like." She picked up the ham and carried it inside to the cold storage. It was, she calculated, an additional 3 weeks of protein at their current rate of consumption. She began revising her winter projections upward, not with relief exactly, but with the particular satisfaction of a calculation trending in the right direction. That evening, after Thomas had fallen asleep on his pallet near the warm side of the cave wall, and the fire had settled to a deep red steadiness, Elias sat on the low bench he'd built facing the hearth. Clara May sat beside him with her mending. They didn't speak for a long time. The fire moved. The stone held its warmth. Then Elias said quietly in the tone he used for things he'd been thinking about for days before he said them, "If I don't make it through this winter." She put her hand over his without looking up from the mending. Not an interruption exactly. A refusal. A declination of the premise. He was quiet for a moment. The fire said something in its own language. "I'm going to make it through this winter," he said. Different words, same voice. But the quality of them had changed the way that a question sounds different when it becomes a statement. She didn't respond because some things don't need response, they need only witness, and she was there. She worked the needle through the fabric. He breathed, the stone was warm. Outside, the sky was going to whatever it was going to, making its own arrangements. And inside the cave, the fire burned as it had been built to burn, low efficient, steady, the product of careful thought applied to difficult circumstances, which was when she considered it a reasonable description of everything she had made of her life. The next morning, she found Thomas standing outside the cave entrance before sunrise, still in his sleep clothes, looking at the escarpment. She wrapped a blanket around his shoulders and stood beside him. The granite caught the first light coming over the eastern ridge and held it differently from the way wood or soil held light, absorbed it, seemed to generate it from within, as though the stone had its own slow internal relationship with illumination. "It's not an insult anymore," Thomas said. Not a question. She looked at the cliff face, 17 acres of useless rock in one cave, the worst thing Silas Drummond's pinched heart had known how to give. She thought about what it had made of them in 6 weeks, the skills rediscovered. The structure built, the stores accumulated, the particular kind of knowledge that only comes from having to solve problems with what's actually in your hands rather than what you wish you had. "It was never an insult," she said. "He just didn't know what he was giving us." Thomas took the oval gray stone from his pocket and placed it in her apron. Then he went inside to help with breakfast. Clara May stood a moment longer with the stone in her hand, feeling its weight, looking at the rock face in the early light. Some things are given as wounds and received as foundations. She had not yet found the language for this. She suspected it might take the whole winter to find it. The sky changed on the 3rd day of November in a way that had nothing to do with clouds. Clara May noticed it first at the horizon line above the northern ridge, where the color was wrong in a way that resisted description. Not the pewter gray of ordinary overcast, not the blue-black of a storm, building in real time, but something colder and more deliberate, a metallic sheen like the flat of a blade held at an angle, reflecting a light source that wasn't the sun. Her grandmother had called it the sky taking a breath. She had been 9 years old the first time she'd seen it and had not understood. She was 34 now, standing at the cave entrance with a bundle of cattail stalks under one arm, the morning air so still it felt pressurized, the creek audible from 40 yards away, in a way it hadn't been the previous week, slower, thicker, its voice-changing register as the water remembered what was coming. She stood there for perhaps 2 minutes reading the horizon the way Ruth had taught her to read it, not with the analytical part of the mind, but with the older part, the part that stored pattern across years. Then she went inside and began taking inventory with a specificity she hadn't applied since the day they'd moved in. Elias watched her from his workbench, a plank across 2 stones where he had been fitting a new handle to the hatchet, his eyes tracking her movement through the jars and parcels without asking. He'd learned early in their marriage that when she moved through a space with that particular quality of focus, the appropriate response was to let her move. Thomas looked up from the flat stone where he'd been practicing his letters in charcoal. He looked at his mother, then at the cave entrance, then back at his mother. He put the charcoal down, picked up the small hatchet he had been assigned for kindling. Splitting Elias had made the assignment 2 weeks prior, treating it with the seriousness of an apprenticeship, which was exactly what it was, and went outside to work the kindling pile without being asked. This was the household Clara May had built, or that they had built together, one that ran on observation rather than instruction, on understanding rather than rule. She counted everything twice. Pemmican blocks 31, clay jars of dried berry 3 full 1/2, Cattail root flour enough for 6 weeks at their current rate of use, perhaps 8 if she reduced portions by a quarter. Smoked ham, 2/3 remaining after the first week's portions. Dried wild onion sufficient. Rendered fat 4 jars, which was 2 more than she thought. Potatoes in the sand bin, she dug her hand in at 3 points and counted by feel, estimating the total. Enough. More than enough if the winter ran its ordinary length. If it ran longer than ordinary, the calculation changed. She began making a second category of pemmican that afternoon, denser than the first batch. Smaller portions, more fat relative to berry, designed to deliver the maximum available energy in the minimum possible volume. This was not the pemmican of an ordinary winter. This was the pemmican of a contingency she didn't want to name but was too careful not to prepare for. Elias finished the hatchet handle and came to where she was working. He didn't ask about the second batch. He looked at the proportions she was using. Looked at her face. "I'll go further up the creek tomorrow," he said. "There's a deadfall I saw last week I didn't think we'd need." She had thought they wouldn't need it either. Take Thomas for the hauling. He's strong for his size. He's getting stronger. This was how they planned, not with maps or lists or formal discussion, but with a kind of shorthand that had developed over years of shared necessity, a language of inference and implication that covered more ground in fewer words than most conversations managed in many. The weather held for 4 more days, cold increasingly so, but clear the sky, that unsettling metallic color each morning before the direct sun hit it and normalized it towards something less ominous. They used the days hard. Elias and Thomas made 2 trips up the creek to the deadfall, hauling sections back with a rope sling rigged from the heaviest cord they had. The splitting was Elias's work, the stacking Clara May's Thomas, handing up each piece with a seriousness that had stopped being imitation and become genuine contribution. By the end of the 5th day, the woodpile had grown by another half cord. On the afternoon of the 6th day, Aldous Crane rode past on his bay horse. She saw him on the trail below before he saw them, or before he acknowledged seeing them. She was never sure with Crane how much of his inattention was genuine. He was dressed well, as he always was, his coat in a dark wool he recognized as expensive. Even from a distance, his boots polished to a degree that communicated that his mornings contained leisure unavailable to people who move their own firewood. He was riding toward the north end of the valley, where she had heard from the freighter who'd stopped 3 weeks prior. He was overseeing the construction of a new storage barn, a substantial structure with a soaring roof line and milled lumber hauled in at considerable expense. Crane's horse slowed as he passed the point on the trail where their cave was visible. He looked up. She watched him take in the scene. The woodpile, the smoke rising from the rock face, the garden terrace cleared and tidy, and the expression that crossed his face was the one she had expected, the small, superior smile of a man who has made his assessment and found it confirms his prior conclusions. He shook his head once, a barely perceptible movement, and touched his heels to the horse's flanks. Clara May turned back to her work without shifting her weight or changing her pace. She was pounding dried berry with a smooth river stone, the impact regular and meditative. And she continued as she watched, in the corner of her vision, Crane disappear around the trail's curve toward his new barn and its soaring roofline. She thought, he is building something to be seen. We are building something to last. The difference between those two intentions was not visible from a distance. The difference would become visible in time, and not the kind of time that required patience, the kind that required only winter. The thought was not triumphant. It was simply accurate. That evening, after Thomas was asleep, Clara May mixed a stronger version of the Winter's Friend tea and set it to steep while she worked on the mending she'd been setting aside for 2 weeks. Elias's breathing had been rougher for the past 3 days. The hauling had cost him something. She wasn't going to mention this because mentioning it would accomplish nothing except making him feel like a burden, which he wasn't, which he would never be. She could make the tea stronger and keep the fire at a consistent temperature through the night, and ensure the copper mesh stayed clear so the air maintained the quality his lungs required. She crossed to where he sat, set the cup near his hand, returned to her mending without comment. He picked up the cup, held it, looked at her with the expression of a man who understands exactly what is being done for him and chooses to receive it without protest. He drank it slowly. By the time she'd finished the mending, his breathing had eased, and he slept that night more deeply than he had all week. She did not sleep at all. She sat in the low firelight with her back against the cave wall, her grandmother's voice moving through her memory with the particular clarity that comes in the small hours. Not the words themselves so much as the tone, the quality of absolute practicality that Ruth had brought to every situation, as though the universe were a problem that had been set specifically so that it could be solved, and the only question was whether you'd paid enough attention to learn the method. She had paid attention. She had always paid attention. She was paying attention now. The morning brought Walt Greer. He came out of the early dark before full sunrise, his buckskin coat rimed with frost, his face carrying the particular alertness of a man who had already been moving through the world for several hours before most people had opened their eyes. He stopped at the flat rock near the garden terrace that had become, in the weeks since his first visit, a kind of informal meeting point. Thomas heard him first and was at the entrance before Clara May. Elias came to stand beside her in the doorway, his hatchet in his hand from the morning's work, not as a weapon but as a tool that happened to be present. Walt said, "I've been along the northern ridgeline, 3 days out, 2 back." He said this the way men who travel alone state routes as context, not narrative. There's a pressure system building out past the ridges, bigger than anything I've read in this valley in 40 years of reading it. He paused, not for effect, but to make sure the information landed with its proper weight. "I can't tell you when it arrives. Could be 5 days, could be 10. But when it comes, it won't be a snowstorm. It'll be something else." Clara May. "How long will it last?" Walt considered this with the honesty of someone who doesn't overstate his certainty. A week, could be more. The pressure signatures on a system this size, they don't behave the way the smaller ones do. They stall. He looked at the woodpile. His expression did not change, but something in his posture did a slight recalibration, a quiet upward revision. "You've done well. Then do more." He turned to go. He stopped. "I'll be at my winter place on the east rock face when it hits. I've weathered there before. Don't come looking for me until you've had 2 full days of silence after the wind dies. The drifts between here and there will be impassable before they settle." He looked at Thomas. "Boy." Thomas stood very straight. "Sir, your mother knows what she's doing. You pay attention to her the same way you're paying attention right now, you'll be fine." He nodded once the compression of whatever else he might have said and walked back toward the tree line. The mule, which had been standing at the trail edge with the philosophical patience of a mule that has waited in many places, turned and followed. Clara May stood at the cave entrance for a moment after he was gone. The sky above the northern ridge had that color again, the blade-flat metallic sheen that her grandmother had called the sky taking a breath. Bigger than anything in 40 years. The phrase arranged itself in her thinking like a beam going into a load-bearing position. Not panic, something you build around. She went inside and called to Thomas, "Come help me with the inventory." They spent the rest of that morning going through everything a third time, Clara May calling out quantities and Thomas repeating them back in the method she'd established for teaching him numbers with purpose rather than abstraction. She began identifying what could be compressed, the sleeping arrangements, which she could restructure to share heat more efficiently, the fire management, which she could adjust to burn slower with less wood per hour through the coldest nights, the water situation, which the seep at the rear of the cave would handle as long as the temperature stayed above freezing. Elias, when she walked him through the adjustments, listened with his hands still at his sides. His thinking posture, the one that meant he was hearing everything and filtering it through his own assessment. At the end, he said, "The door. I want to add a second layer of insulation." He meant the space between the cave face and the exterior of the door frame, which he'd left as a simple fit. "I'll pack it with moss and rivenwood. Anything that gets through the door faces a second wall before it faces us." This had not been in either of their plans. It was better than both their plans. How long? 2 days if the moss isn't frozen yet. It isn't. There's a north-facing bank along the creek, stays damp long into the cold. I'll start this afternoon. They worked the next 2 days with a purposefulness that felt different from their earlier industry. Not the purposefulness of building something new, but the purposefulness of completing something that had been underway all along, of fastening the last fastenings before the thing that was coming arrived. Elias packed the doors surround with layered moss and thin split wood until the entrance had the thermal character of a wall. Thomas hauled moss in his small arms with a focused efficiency that had moved entirely past imitation into genuine understanding of stakes. Clara May processed everything that remained unprocessed, the last of the late-season berries she'd been holding back. The final batch of pemmican, a preparation of cattail root flour mixed with fat that would bake into dense, flat cakes on the hearthstone when the time came. On the second evening, the fever came for Elias. She knew it before he said anything, knew it from the quality of his stillness at the workbench, the kind that came from the body redirecting its resources inward. She was beside him with her hand on his forehead before he'd formulated whatever stoic declaration he'd been about to make. The heat in his skin was considerable. His breathing had shifted back toward the pronounced whistle, the direction it indicated, not small at all. She installed him on the pallet. She stoked the fire to a specific temperature, warm enough for the healing work the body needed to do, not so warm that it would drive the fever higher. She brewed the winter's friend tea at twice the normal concentration, adding a preparation of dried willow bark she'd been saving in one of the smaller jars because she'd known in the back of her mind that tracked probabilities without announcing them that something like this was a possibility. The willow bark would address the fever directly. The tea would address the lungs. Sleep and warmth would address everything else. Thomas sat in his corner and did not play with his twig figures. He held his stone. He watched his mother work with an expression that was not fear, it's only more, a very serious attention, the expression of someone committing a procedure to permanent memory. She worked through the evening without stopping. Not frantically, there was nothing useful in frenzy, nothing. It accomplished that calm precision couldn't accomplish better, but continuously with the full commitment of her attention on every step. When the tea was ready, she got Elias to drink it in slow portions, the way the body accepts things it needs gradually without coercion. His eyes were bright in the way that meant elevated temperature rather than alertness. She kept her expression neutral, her movement steady, not to perform calm for his benefit, but because she was calm, because panic was a luxury available to people who had time to spare, and she did not. Sometime after midnight, she realized she was crying. Not in the way of despair, a few tears quiet, while her hands continued working, while her mind continued its computations of dosage and timing and temperature. It was the kind of crying that the body does when it has been holding something tightly for a long time and a seam gives slightly in a place that can afford to give. She was not afraid he would die. She refused that particular future with the same absolute determination with which she had refused it the night he tried to raise a subject. But she was aware in a way she had not permitted herself to be aware until this specific private moment of how much of what she'd built, the pemmican, the shelves, the careful teas, the second batch of dense provisions had been built for him. Not for survival in the abstract, for his survival. For the particular continued existence of this man with the carpenter's hands and the quiet voice and the capacity to look at a dark hole in a rock face and see what it could become. She wiped her face on her sleeve and continued working. By morning, the fever had broken. It moved through Elias's body in the way high fevers move when they've been correctly managed, a drenching sweat around the third hour of darkness, a long stillness after that, and then near dawn, a quality of sleep that was genuine rest rather than the body fighting with itself. She sat beside him in the early light from the fire and felt something she recognized after a moment's consideration as gratitude, not the mild social variety, but the cellular kind, the gratitude of someone who has looked directly at a specific loss and then watched it fail to occur. Thomas appeared at her elbow, still in his sleep clothes, carrying 2 cups. He'd made the tea himself, the ordinary breakfast variety, not the medicinal one, correctly identifying that the crisis had passed and normal function was resuming. The proportions were right. She looked at him and he looked at her, and something passed between them that didn't need language. Elias was upright by midday, diminished but present, the particular translucent quality of someone who has burned something off. He refused to remain on the pallet past noon, which Clara May allowed, because enforced rest for a man like Elias caused its own kind of damage. She redirected him to lighter work, sharpening tools, mending the basket he'd woven 2 weeks prior that had developed a split along one-side tasks that kept his hands engaged without costing him the reserves he needed to rebuild. He worked without protest and without the sullenness that sometimes accompanied a proud person's acceptance of limitation. He simply did what was useful at the scale that was currently available to him. 2 days later, the first snow fell. It came in the night, quiet and unremarkable, 3 or 4 inches by morning, the kind of snow that settled on surfaces and made the world look briefly considered, as though someone had given it a single coat of white and stopped to see how it looked. Clara May stood outside in the early morning and looked at the snow on the valley floor and thought about the townspeople, how they would look at this and see relief, a light winter, a manageable season, cause for optimism about prices in the spring. She looked at the sky above the northern ridge. The metallic color was not gone. It had deepened the blade shade, becoming something more committed, a color she now understood as preparation rather than threat. The sky organizing itself for something it had already decided to do. She went inside and sealed the last of the dried herbs into their jars. On the afternoon of the 3rd day after the first snow, Thomas found her packing the final provisions into the cold storage and said with the directness he'd inherited from both his parents, "Mama, when is it coming?" She was quiet for a moment, not deciding whether to answer, but deciding how. Truth delivered without proportion did as much damage as lies. "Soon," she said, "but we're ready." He looked around the cave, the jars ranked on their shelves, the woodpile visible through the door, the fire burning at its steady, controlled depth in the hearth. His father at the workbench with a fine chisel, the light warm and reliable. He appeared to take a complete inventory of his own, cross-referencing what he saw against some internal standard he'd been developing. "Yes," he said, apparently agreeing with her assessment. He went back to his letters. "The snow that fell the following week is different. Not in its first hours, it came the same way the first snow had come, quiet, preliminary, but by the second day it had declared its intentions. It fell in the manner of something that had decided to continue. Not a blizzard yet, not the wind that Walt had described, but a committed vertical accumulation that didn't pause for morning or afternoon, that built on the valley floor with the patient arithmetic of a debt. The creek disappeared under it by the 3rd day. The cottonwoods acquired new dimensions, their branches thickened to twice their size. Clara May sealed the door. Their world became the cave. She organized the space so that each person had a clear function. During the hours of the day, Elias at his workbench for the mornings, the tools and small projects providing the structure his mind required. Thomas at his flat stone with his charcoal letters, and then in the afternoons, the plant identification lessons she conducted using the dried specimens she'd stored specifically for this purpose. Herself at the hearth, the work table, the ongoing management of their provisions. She shifted to a lower, longer burn, feeding the fire with the dense hardwood she'd saved specifically for deep winter, building a bed of coals that would hold heat for hours with minimal new fuel. The damper she adjusted morning and evening. The copper mesh ventilation she checked on a schedule she kept in her head. The temperature inside the cave stabilized at a level she would not have chosen for a house, but accepted for a cave, warm enough for the body to function, warm enough to keep the cold storage from freezing, warm enough for Thomas's bare feet on the stone floor in the mornings. She taught. This was something she had not anticipated as a component of winter survival, but which turned out to be essential to it. The teaching kept Thomas occupied, kept his mind moving in directions that were productive rather than anxious, kept her connected to the transmission of knowledge that had been Ruth's great project and that Clara May had not fully understood until now as a project she'd inherited. She taught him the plants how to read the fire for information about wood quality and air circulation, the mathematics of provisioning how to calculate the relationship between what you had and how long it needed to last, how to adjust when the duration was uncertain. He was quick, quicker than she'd understood, in the way that children's capacities are sometimes only visible when the right circumstances reveal them. Elias worked. He carved a new handle for the full-size axe, repaired the basket, wove a second one from the willow withes he'd cut and dried in October for precisely this purpose, his hands moving through the familiar pattern with the ease of a man whose body has internalized a process so thoroughly that the conscious mind is freed for other things. He talked to Thomas during these sessions not about carpentry specifically, but about wood, about what wood knew about the way different trees made different decisions about how to grow. Clara May listened to these conversations from the hearthside and felt something she had no adequate word for, a compound sensation involving gratitude and something that pressed against the edges of grief without being. Grief, the awareness that these voices in this warm stone space with the fire going and the world suspended outside was the thing that mattered, had always been the thing that mattered. On the fourth evening after sealing the door, the wind arrived. It didn't build gradually. It arrived at full volume of physical presence, a pressure that could be felt through the door, even before it could be clearly heard, a change in the air inside the cave, a subtle compression as though the outside were trying to push itself in. Then the sound came low at first, and then rising through registers that didn't have names, a sustained roar that oscillated, building to pitches that made the fire lean sideways in the hearthstone, and then easing slightly before building again. Not a storm passing through. A storm that had arrived at a destination and intended to remain. Thomas moved from his pallet to the space between his parents without being told, and neither of them said anything about it because there was nothing to say. He was 6 years old, and the world outside the stone walls was doing something that adults with 40 years of experience took seriously, and his response was precisely appropriate. Clara May put her arm around him. She could feel the solidity of his small body, the way he held himself upright, even while leaning against her. His father's spine, his father's refusal to fold. Elias reached across Thomas and put his hand over hers, where it rested on the boy's shoulder. The fever had cost him something and given him something back in the exchange, a different quality of stillness. The stillness of a man who has looked at his own fragility and decided not to be defined by it. The fire burned. The stone absorbed the wind's assault without comment, as stone has always done, not resisting, not fighting back, simply being what it was, which was older and more patient than anything the sky could organize against it. Clara May thought about Aldous Crane's new barn, with its soaring roofline milled lumber and the satisfaction of being seen to have prospered. She thought about the farmhouses in the valley, their wooden frames and plank walls, and the particular vulnerability of anything built to impress rather than to endure. She did not think about this with satisfaction, only a kind of sorrow for the people inside those wooden walls, people who had made the calculations available to them, with the knowledge available to them, and whom the night was now grading on a curve they hadn't known existed. She added a piece of hardwood to the fire, small and precise, exactly sufficient. She adjusted the damper one to increment. She checked the copper mesh ventilation from across the room, confirming the faint thread of cold, clean air that meant the system was doing what it had been designed to do. The wind outside went up another register, a sound like the valley itself was complaining. Inside, warmth, light, the breathing of the people she loved. Provision enough for months, stone overhead that had been overhead before her grandmother's grandmother was born. A door that fit its frame so exactly that not one thread of cold could find a path through it. She was not simply ready for the morning after. She was something larger than ready, prepared in the way that preparation taken all the way to its completion becomes a form of knowledge. The knowledge that you have done everything that can be done, that the rest belongs to the particular arithmetic of the universe, and that the stone above you is not indifferent to your survival so much as it is magnificently unconditionally stable. The night was long. She stayed awake through most of it, not from anxiety, but from the particular alertness of someone who is witnessing something, who understands that they are inside a moment that will matter later. She watched the fire. She watched Elias sleep with his hands still resting near hers on the blanket. She watched Thomas eventually tip sideways into sleep against her side, with the sudden completeness of childhood, one hand still holding his stone. She listened to the wind work itself into new configurations and exhaust them, and find others relentless, enormous of force that had traveled vast distances to arrive here and spend itself against this particular piece of rock. The rock did not negotiate. The rock did not yield. The rock had been making the same answer to the same question for longer than the question itself had existed in any language she could access. Some things are worth understanding before you need them. She had understood this one on the day they'd walked to Drummond's Folly with everything they owned in a handcart, other people's contempt, still audible in the silence behind them. She had understood it and come here anyway, not because she'd had a choice, but because the absence of choice had clarified something that too many choices had previously obscured. The wind rose to a register that had no precedent in her experience, a sound that passed through sound into something physical, vibration rather than noise, something felt in the chest rather than heard by the ear. The fire leaned, the shadows moved. Outside, the storm said what it had come to say. Inside, the fire answered with the only language that mattered. The silence arrived like a physical object, something with mass and edges, something that displaced the air. It replaced. Clara May had been awake when the wind stopped. She had been awake for most of the previous 2 days, sleeping in intervals of an hour or less, her body operating on the maintenance schedule of someone who understands that rest is a resource to be budgeted, not a luxury to be taken. And the cessation was so absolute, so total, that it woke Elias from a deep sleep 3 feet away and brought Thomas upright on his pallet, with his eyes wide before his mind had fully crossed the border from dreaming. They sat in the cave's warmth and listened to nothing. The fire had burned to a deep coal bed, red-orange and steady, throwing a low, reliable heat that had kept the chamber at its necessary temperature through the night without requiring the larger feeding she'd have given it if she'd been less careful with the hardwood. She'd been very careful with the hardwood. She'd been careful with everything. Thomas whispered, "Is it over?" Elias looked at Clara May. She looked at the door, solid-fitted, moss-packed at every seam, showing no light at the edges because there was no light yet. The pre-dawn dark, still complete outside, whatever thickness of snow now stood between them and the sky. She looked at the ventilation mesh in the upper corner. The thread of cold air was present, still flowing. That meant the exterior of the mesh was not blocked, which meant whatever had accumulated outside had not sealed them completely. "We wait," she said. 2 full days of silence, as Walt had specified, the instruction delivered in the tone of someone reporting a physical fact rather than giving advice. "We wait," Thomas repeated, not as a question, not as complaint, but as confirmation, the way he'd learned to confirm plans by repeating them back with the same weight they had been given. The first day of silence they managed with the household order they'd established. The work was quieter than usual, more interior, each of them moving through their tasks with a seriousness that acknowledged what they were waiting for without dwelling on it. She made breakfast from the flat cakes she'd prepared before the storm, Hearthstone baked dense, a concentrated version of nutrition that her grandmother would have recognized immediately, and made the medicinal tea for Elias without ceremony, setting it where his hand would find it. His breathing was the best it had been since before the fever, which she took as information about what sustained warmth and consistent nutrition and sufficient rest could accomplish when a person's body was allowed the conditions it required. She had given him those conditions. She had engineered them. Thomas spent the morning on his letters and the afternoon asking questions about the plants she'd been teaching him. Not the identification questions, but a second layer of inquiry. He wanted to know why the same plant could be medicine in one preparation and not another. She explained the principles her grandmother had given her: concentration, preparation method, the state of the plant. At harvest, the body's condition when it receives what the plant offers. He listened with his particular quality of attention, the kind that left no residue of distraction. By evening, she had confirmed to herself that the silence was holding. The kind of meteorological silence that means completion, not intermission. On the second day, she began preparing for what came next. Elias understood what she was doing before she said anything. He watched her set out the extra coats, check the rope coil, assess the small hand tools she'd moved to an accessible position. He stood up from the workbench and rolled his shoulders, testing the space of his own body, gauging his reserves. "I'll dig," he said. "We'll take turns." Not a negotiation, a plan. He looked at her with the expression she'd learned to read as acceptance, delivered with full awareness of its terms, not resignation, but a practical recognition that she was right, that his lungs required the turns, that insisting otherwise would cost more than it demonstrated. "Thomas handles the snow inside." Thomas, hearing his name, looked up. He received the assignment the same way he always did, as a plan already understood, ready to execute. The second morning's silence was complete and cold and absolute. She allowed them to sleep later than usual. The bodies needed it, and the work ahead required what rest could restore. She was the first up, banking the fire forward from the coal bed, warming the cave to a temperature that would make the coming exertion manageable. She heated the remaining oatmeal, portioned it with dried berry-made strong tea. They ate without speaking much, the way people eat before serious work. Elias took the short-handled axe to the top corner of the door, beginning carefully finding the boundary between wood and what was outside. When he broke through the snow, came in as a small cascade, not the powder of fresh accumulation, but the dense compressed material of a drift that had settled and hardened under its own weight and the pressure of everything above it. It fell onto the cave floor with a heaviness that made Thomas's eyes go wide for a moment, then narrow with something that looked in a 6-year-old remarkably like determination. The wall of snow visible through the opening was not white. It was blue-white, the color of compressed depth, and it offered no sky, no light source other than the faint luminescence of ice crystals, holding whatever had filtered down through feet of packed drift. There was no way to know from this opening how thick the seal was, how far they'd need to dig, how long it would take. That was the nature of it. You couldn't know until you were inside it. This was the moment she had prepared for without knowing its exact shape, the moment when all the calculation ended and the physical fact began. Elias began to dig upward at an angle, not straight out, which would require moving too much dense material, but rising diagonally, following the line of least resistance toward where the drift surface would be. He worked in 3-minute intervals, trading the shovel to Clara May, who worked in 3-minute intervals, trading back. The space in the tunnel was narrow enough that only one person could work the face at a time, and the air in the tunnel was different from the cave air, closer, cooler, carrying the particular quality of enclosed snow, which was not unbreathable but was not comfortable either. Thomas moved snow from the tunnel mouth into the cold storage area, working steadily, carrying what his small arms could carry, making trip after trip, with the focused efficiency of someone who has understood that the sum of small contributions is the only arithmetic available to him. The first 20 minutes were the hardest. The angle of the dig brought them through the densest section of the drift, where compression had turned the snow to a texture closer to coarse ice than powder, where the shovel required significant force to break each load free. Elias's breathing in the tunnel was audible, even from the cave, working hard, the body spending reserves it would need to rebuild again. Clara May tracked this while she tracked the progress of the hole. She did not ask him to stop. Stopping now in the middle of the density would be more costly than continuing through it. She thought about nothing except the next shovel load. This was a technique her grandmother had described as giving the mind a job small enough to do, When the full scope of a problem is too large to be useful, you make the problem the size of the shovel, the size of the next 3 minutes, the size of the snow in front of your face right now. You don't dig out of a buried cave. You move this particular load of snow and then the next one, and eventually the buried cave digs itself out. Elias's shovel broke through into open air on the fourth hour. Not dramatically, there was no sudden flood of light, no explosion of brightness. A small hole appeared in the snow above them, perhaps the diameter of a man's fist, and through it came a shaft of winter sunlight so white and so direct after days of firelight that both of them had to shield their eyes against it. The air that came through the hole was cold enough to sting genuine cold, the cold of open space after a week of compressed warmth. But it was fresh in a way that the cave air, good as Elias's ventilation had kept it, could not replicate. Thomas, hearing the change in the quality of sound from the tunnel, appeared at the mouth of it. He looked at the shaft of light. He was 6 years old and he had been inside a sealed stone cave for 7 days, and the light coming through that small hole was the first direct sunlight he had seen in all of that time. He made a sound that Clara May had no category for. Not a cry, not a laugh, something prior to both a sound the body makes when it receives something it has been without long enough to understand its value. She widened the hole until it would admit a body climbing through first, because she wanted to assess what they were climbing into before Elias's lungs were committed to the exertion of the climb, and because this was simply how she was built to go first when the conditions were uncertain, to send back information before asking anyone she loved to commit to the unknown. She emerged onto a landscape that bore no relationship to the one she had last seen. The valley was gone. In its place was an abstract terrain of sculpted white drifts built into shapes that had the quality of arrested motion waves caught mid-collapse ridges, formed and then smoothed by winds that were no longer operating. The snow surface was hard enough to walk on. Her weight spread across it, and she sank only an inch or two into the crust before it held. The sky above was a blue of extraordinary clarity, the specific blue that only appears after a major weather system has scoured the air of everything that isn't itself deep, transparent, and a blue that seemed to recede infinitely upward. The cave was completely invisible. Where it should have been was a drift that rose halfway up the cliff face, a smooth slope of consolidated snow that looked like a permanent feature of the geography, like something the valley had always contained. She was standing on the roof of their home. The thought had a quality she couldn't quite classify, vertiginous, and underneath the vertigo, something close to wonder. She helped Elias up through the hole, steadying him as he cleared the edge and got his footing on the crust surface. He stood upright beside her and was silent for a long moment, taking in the transformed valley. His breath made large clouds in the still air. His face had the expression of a man whose internal model of the world has just been required to revise itself significantly. Thomas came up last, Clara May taking his hands and pulling him clear of the hole, and when he stood on the snow surface and looked out at the white world, his expression was not the complex adult experience of disorientation she'd seen on Elias's face. It was simpler than that, the pure data-gathering expression of a child encountering something genuinely new, calibrating his understanding of what the world was capable of. He bent down, picked up a stone that had been deposited on the surface by some action of the storm's smooth gray oval. He placed it in his mother's hand without looking at her face. She felt the weight of it alongside the first stone, the one he'd given her in September. 2 stones, the same gray, the same smoothness. As though the valley had produced a matched pair bookending something. The walk to the settlement took 3 hours for 2 miles. The snow surface was navigable, but not simple wind-formed ridges crossed it at angles that required constant small adjustments of balance. And in the lower valley where the terrain was flatter, the crust had formed unevenly solid in some places and soft in others, with no visible indication of which was which. Elias moved carefully, pacing himself. Thomas moved beside Clara May with his hand in hers, not from fear, but from the practical recognition that unfamiliar terrain required the additional data point of another person's response to share. As they came closer to the settlement, the signs accumulated. Tops of fence posts emerging from the snow at irregular heights. A length of rope strung between two posts, clearly an improvised guideline now half buried. The remnant of what had been a chicken coop, its structure collapsed inward under the load. Its boards splayed outward in a pattern that told the story of a failure that had been both structural and sudden. The settlement itself came into view as a collection of smoke sources and exposed roof lines, some complete, some not. Several roof lines she could immediately identify as wrong. The angle broken, the ridge sagged, the silhouette of a building that had failed under weight. One structure had lost its entire roof in a clean separation, the walls standing the interior open to the sky, the snow inside level with the windowsills. The large storage barn she'd seen Crane riding toward in November, the one with the soaring roofline, milled lumber, and pride, was a geometric ruin. Its ambitious ridge beams snapped at the center point. Both halves collapsed inward. The walls bowed outward from the pressure of the failure. Months of expense and planning and the particular satisfaction of being seen to prosper reduced in the space of one night to a problem of debris removal. The first person they encountered was a man named Peterson, a wheat farmer from the eastern edge of the valley, a man whose nods to them in the main street during the previous autumn had been calibrated to the precise degree of acknowledgement appropriate to their diminished status. He was standing at the base of a drift near what had been the livery stable, his shovel planted in the snow beside him, his face carrying an expression she had no immediate reference for, a combination of physical exhaustion and something deeper, the particular hollowness of a person who has witnessed things they weren't prepared to witness and is still processing the inventory. He saw them coming across the snow and went very still. She understood, watching his face, that he had not expected to see them. Not this morning, not walking out of the north end of the valley under their own power, not the three of them together with color in their faces and steadiness in their steps. Peterson's voice, when it came, had the rawness of a man who had been speaking to people about difficult things for hours. "We thought the drifts on the north side, we assumed no one up there." He stopped, reorganized. "We thought you were gone, Clara May. We were in the cave." He looked at her for a moment in the specific way that people look at simple statements that contain more complexity than their surfaces suggest, trying to take in the full implication of four words that reordered everything he'd assumed about the outcome of the past week. Then his gaze moved to Elias, who was standing straight, with his hands at his sides, diminished in the way of recovery, but present, unambiguously alive. Then to Thomas, who was looking at the ruined barn with the focused interest of a child who finds structural failure interesting rather than distressing. The scope of what had happened came to her in pieces, the way information arrives in the aftermath of a disaster, not as a complete picture, but as a series of specific facts that gradually assembled into something she could understand. More than a dozen people were gone, some lost in the storm itself, attempting crossings they'd believed were survivable, some lost when their structures failed in the night. One family overcome by cold when their wood supply ran short on the fourth day, and they'd had no alternative resource to turn to. The failures had not been failures of will or courage. They had been failures of preparation, of the specific, unglamorous, relentless preparation that the valley's ordinary winters had not previously demanded, and that this winter had demanded without mercy. Aldous Crane was alive. She saw him before he saw her. He was sitting on a wooden chair that someone had placed outside the ruins of his house. The house itself had lost half its roof. The east wing collapsed, the structure salvageable, but not in its current form, wrapped in a dark blanket, his hands visible on his knees, his posture, the posture of a man whose scaffolding has been removed and who is discovering what remains when it is gone. The polished boots were ruined. The expensive coat was gone, replaced by what appeared to be a borrowed work jacket. His face, when he looked up at the sound of footsteps in the snow, was the face of a man who had been reduced to his actual dimensions. Not the performed dimensions of the bank office, the wide desk, the glass windows catching the profitable light, but the true ones, which were the dimensions of a person who had lost his wife 3 days into the storm when the bedroom ceiling gave way under the accumulated weight, who had spent the subsequent days in the company of his own survival, while the specific person who had made survival feel like something worth doing was no longer present to receive it. He looked at Clara May. She watched his eyes move across her face, the clarity in it, the color, the evidence of a person who had been fed and warmed for the duration of what he had endured, uncovered and diminished, then moved to Elias, then to Thomas. And the calculation he was performing was visible in his face because he no longer had the resources available to conceal it. He was adding something up. The result was arriving at an expression she had never seen on his face before, the expression of a man who has been wrong about something important for long enough that the wrongness has compound interest he hadn't anticipated. He tried to speak. What came out was not words, a dry, compressed sound, the sound that grief makes when it is too large for the available opening. He put his head down. Clara May reached into the canvas bag she carried and removed the cloth package of pemmican she'd brought, dense, preserved, sufficient for several days of genuine nutrition for multiple people. She held it out to Peterson, who was standing nearby with a shovel. "Share this with the people who need it most. You'll know better than I do who that is." Peterson took the package with both hands, the gesture of someone receiving something understood to be more than it appeared. She did not look at Crane again, not from contempt. Contempt requires energy. She had no reason to spend on him, and besides, what she had seen in his face was a man already in the process of a reckoning that no additional attention from her could accelerate or complete. He would arrive where he arrived on the schedule that grief and humility operate on, which is their own schedule, unhurried by outside observation. She had given him what was available to give, which was the sight of her family alive, which was the evidence that the choice she'd made, that Silas Drummond's unwilling, contemptuous, accidental gift had forced her to make, had been the right choice in the only way that the word right finally means anything. It had kept them. She turned toward the trail north and was walking before she'd formed the complete thought. They were moving back through the valley when she heard footsteps behind her, deliberate, unhurried, the footsteps of someone who has covered significant ground on foot and for whom more ground is simply more ground. She turned. Walt Greer came across the snow crust from the direction of the eastern rock face, his buckskin coat still intact, his long rifle at its accustomed position. He was walking with the same measured pace she'd observed the first time she'd seen him, the pace of a man whose relationship to distance is so well established that it requires no particular effort. His face showed the particular quality of alertness that sustained solitary outdoor existence produces focused reading, everything comfortable with the reading. He stopped when he reached them. His eyes moved across all three of them with the assessment she'd come to expect from him, thorough, quick, arriving at conclusions without advertising the process. "Clara May, your place held." "Walt, it held." Then, after a pause that had the quality of something considered before being released, "I came past the north side of the valley on the way down, saw the drift on the rock face, saw 3 sets of tracks coming out of it." Something moved in his expression. Not quite a smile, something prior to that, the facial equivalent of a satisfied calculation. "Figured you'd done what needed doing. Elias, the ventilation made the difference. The air stayed good the whole time." Walt looked at him for a moment, at the pallor of recent illness, the steadiness of the stance, the fact of him standing on the snow in the winter sun alive. "Copper mesh. From a broken strainer." Walt nodded, the nod of one practical person acknowledging another solution to a problem both understand. He looked at Thomas. Thomas looked back at him with the unfiltered directness he'd maintained since the first meeting. Walt said, "You did your part." Thomas, seriously, "I moved the snow." That was the part that needed doing. Something passed between the old man and the bard, a recognition across a span of years that was nearly the total length of a century of a shared quality, the quality of people who observe carefully and act on what they observe without wasting the interval between the two. Clara May saw it and felt it as a kind of passage and informal transfer of something that didn't have a name but was real. Walt looked at the settlement behind them, the smoke, the ruined roof lines, the figures moving through the snow with the slow purposefulness of people managing aftermath. They'll need the winter to understand what happened, he said, not unkindly, as a fact about human nature that his 40 years of observation had confirmed. Some of them will, Clara May said. Some of them won't. That's not something I can determine for them. He looked at her. The quality of the look was different from his usual assessment, less evaluative, more acknowledging the look of a person, setting aside the measuring instrument, because the measurement has already been made and is already complete. He turned and walked back toward the eastern rock face, not hurrying, not looking back, the mule appearing from somewhere to fall into step behind him, as though it had been waiting at a considered distance for exactly this. Thomas watched him go. Then he turned to his mother and put his hand in hers, ready to walk back. They made the return journey faster than the morning's outward trip. They knew the route, now knew which ridges to take at an angle, which sections of crust bore weight reliably where the snow was deceptive. Elias walked with his stride slightly shortened from the morning's exertion, his breath in visible puffs, steady. Clara May stayed at his pace without making an adjustment of pace visible, which was a skill she developed over years of managing the distance between someone's dignity and their limitation without collapsing the space between them. At the top of the drift above the cave, Thomas found the entry hole they dug that morning. He got on his stomach and went in feet first with the confidence of someone returning to a known space, his small boots finding the tunnel walls without hesitation. Elias went next. Clara May went last, pulling the makeshift cover Elias had fashioned from a piece of split wood across the opening behind her, sealing the cold out with the practiced motion of someone who has done the same thing enough times that the body does it correctly without being asked. Inside warmth. The fire had banked exactly as she'd left it, the coal bed still hot, needing only a piece of hardwood and a breath of air through the damper to wake back into flame. She fed it. She watched it take. The cave filled with the specific quality of light that firelight makes in an enclosed stone space, sourceless warm, moving at the edges, the light of a place that is generating its own illumination rather than borrowing it from outside. She put a pot of water on the hearthstone. She began the preparations for a real meal. Not the ration maintenance feeding of the storm days, but something genuine using portions she'd been holding in reserve specifically for this moment. Dried beans reconstituted and cooked with the last of the smoked ham, boned the broth thick and caloric and fragrant with dried wild onion. Flat cakes on the hearthstone. The ordinary winter's friend tea brewed at normal concentration, the medicinal urgency of the previous week suspended for now. Thomas sat at his flat stone with his charcoal, but he didn't work on letters. He drew careful, deliberate strokes, the image emerging as something that might have been the cave entrance from outside, or the cliff face or a door set in stone. He considered it for a while, then added 3 small figures standing beside it. He appeared satisfied with this. Elias sat at the workbench and did not work. He sat with his hands flat on the plank surface, his eyes moving around the cave in the way they moved when he was taking inventory. The shelves still substantially stocked, the cold storage full, the wood pile visible through the inner wall's gap, the tools in their organized positions, the door in its precise fitting. The face of a man accounting for what has been built and finding the account accurate. "We did well," he said to the space, rather than to either of them, specifically the statement of a man who has completed something and is acknowledging the completion. "Clara May, we prepared well. The doing was just preparation becoming necessary." He looked at her across the cave. The fire moved between them. Something passed through his expression that she recognized as the particular quality of appreciation that has nothing to do with thanks and everything to do with recognition, the recognition of one person by another who knows fully and without remainder who they are looking at. She stirred the beans. She listened to the silence outside, which was the silence of a valley covered in 8 feet of snow. Its sounds muffled to near nothing, the world reduced to a version of itself that was still and white and held. Tomorrow or the next day, people from the settlement would come. There would be questions. She'd have to answer assessments made from the outside of what had happened, hear attempts to understand with the vocabulary of ordinary winters what this winter had produced. She would answer the questions. She would accept whatever gestures were made in the direction of acknowledgement. She would perform neither modesty nor satisfaction, because neither was accurate to what she felt, which was something simpler. The plain fundamental feeling of a person who did the right work in the right time and is now on the other side of the consequence. 3 weeks after the storm, when the snow had settled and the worst of the aftermath had been addressed, a man came up the path from the settlement. Peterson, he carried a cloth bundle with seeds in it, practical seeds, useful varieties, the kind of offering that people who have been thinking about next spring make when they've spent a winter thinking about what they should have done differently in the fall. He also carried a folded piece of paper. She read it standing at the cave entrance, Thomas beside her, reading over her hand, because that was the habit she'd built in him, reading everything available to be read, treating written language as a resource like firewood to be gathered whenever it presented itself. The paper was a petition to the county land office requesting formal recognition of their claim to the 17 acres designated Drummond's Folly, with a writer requesting tax abatement for 10 years in acknowledgement of the land's character. It bore 23 signatures arranged in the order they'd apparently been gathered, most of them legible, a few cramped with the penmanship of people who wrote rarely and formally. At the bottom of the page, small in a hand, she recognized from the deed that had been slid across a polished desk 2 fingers at a time, a signature that had once been decisive and official, and was now careful diminished the signature of a man writing from a different place than the one he'd written from before, was the name Aldous Crane. She looked at it for a moment, then she folded the paper along its original creases and held it out to Thomas. He took it with both hands, which was how he'd learned to receive things that required care. He looked at it, then at her face. "Keep it with your stones," she said. "When you're older, you'll know what it cost the man who signed it last." He folded it again and placed it carefully inside the cloth bundle with his collection. The stones, the birch bark owl, the small inventory of things he determined mattered. He tied the bundle closed with the focus he brought to things that deserved it. She stood at the cave entrance in the February light, which was not the exhausted gray of deep winter, but the beginning of something else, a quality of light that was still cold but carrying faintly the suggestion of a direction. The snow on the valley floor had settled 2 feet in the week since the storm, and where the direct afternoon sun hit the south-facing slopes, it had begun, in the warmest part of each day, to release the faintest possible sound. Not a drip, not yet, but the memory of one, the promise of water in its seasonal form moving towards spring with the same quiet inevitability with which it moved toward winter. Silas Drummond had given them a hole in the ground as a final contempt, the last word in a judgment he'd been composing his entire life about people who chose love over property, tenderness over productivity, the grain of wood over the price of cattle. He had meant it as an ending. He had not had the imagination to understand that some people receive an ending as a set of materials, and what they build from those materials is not determined by the person who supplied them. She reached into her apron pocket. Both stones were there, the first from September, the second from February, the valley offering them at the beginning and end of the same season. She held them together in her palm, feeling their weight as a unit, the creek having shaped them separately over years toward the same smoothness, the same gray, the same oval form that fits so exactly in a closed hand. Elias appeared beside him. He didn't ask what she was looking at. He looked at it with her, the valley, the snow, the light angling toward a season they'd earned the right to see. His breathing was the quietest it had been since 1875, the whistle so reduced as to require specific listening to find it. The sustained warmth, the consistent nutrition, The weeks of forced rest that the storm had imposed on even his refusal to be idle, these had returned something to him that she had not been certain could be returned. She had prepared for the possibility that it couldn't. She was glad to have been wrong. Thomas came to the entrance and stood between them, which was where he fit. The three of them stood in the February light and looked at what the winter had left them, which was the valley altered, the cave whole, the provisions substantially intact, the fire burning, each other present. Below them, the settlement was rebuilding the sounds of that reconstruction, carrying up the still air on certain afternoons. Hammer's voices, the specific sounds of people arriving at revised understandings of what they needed their structures to withstand. Some of them would build differently. Some would not, because people contain the full range of what people are capable of, including the capacity to survive something without being changed by it. She had been changed. She knew this the way she knew the stones in her pocket, by direct sensation, by the weight of it, by the way it fit in the hand. The change was not dramatic, not the kind that announces itself. It was the change of someone who has learned the difference between what looks like safety and what actually holds the difference between the soaring roofline and the cave, between the performance of prosperity and the practice of it, between knowing what you need and having prepared to have it when the night comes and the wind starts and the question is asked of everything you have built. The answer had come from stone. It had been stone all along. She closed her hand around the two smooth gray ovals, feeling their paired weight, and looked at the light moving across the granite above them, the same light that had been moving across that same stone since before the valley had a name in any language, before the question of who owned it had occurred to anyone, before a man named Silas Drummond had written a will, and a man named Aldous Crane had pushed a deed across a desk with two fingers. The light was indifferent to all of that. The stone was indifferent to all of that. She was not indifferent. She was here. That was the whole of it. That was in the end the only answer that the question had ever required. Not triumph, not vindication, not the satisfaction of watching a proud man reduced to a chair in the ruins of his ambitions, but simply this: to be present, warm fed together, alive on the other side of the thing that had been sent to diminish her. She had not been diminished. She had been clarified the way a metal is clarified by heat, not destroyed by it, but made more entirely itself, the impurities driven off, the essential nature revealed. The fire was burning inside. Spring was somewhere to the south of them, moving north at its own unhurried pace. The stone above them had been there before she was born, and would be there after everything she'd built had returned to the elements that composed it. And this was not a melancholy thought, but a steadying one. The thought of something that does not require her survival to continue, that was stable before her, and would be stable after that, had offered its stability to her in the form of a dark, cold, useless hole in the ground, and that she had accepted because she had been her grandmother's granddaughter. And her grandmother had known that what one person calls worthless, another calls foundation. She put the stones back in her pocket. She turned to go inside to tend the fire that did not need tending, but that she would tend anyway, because that was the practice, not the dramatic intervention at the moment of crisis, but the daily, unhurried, unglamorous attention to the thing that kept the cold back, one feeding at a time. One winter at a time, for as long as the winters came, which was all of them, which was enough.